Well, I would like to thank everybody involved in bringing me here. It's been an absolutely wonderful 2 days. Over the years I was researching and writing the biography of Katherine Anne Porter, I spent a lot of time in Texas, and I met a lot of wonderful people. The hospitality was always extraordinary, but no place exceeded Victoria. Thank you all so very much. I'm honored and so very pleased to be a part of this reading series and to have an opportunity to meet so many of you. The paper I'm going to read this afternoon evolved in a series of steps. I was convinced early on in my work on Katherine Anne Porter that her life was essential to her fiction, or to understanding her fiction, that she was one of those writers who drew exclusively on her own experience for her fiction, and that if we probed deeply enough, we would find in everything she wrote that kernel of experience that inspired the story. So beginning with that thesis, that idea, I knew that the themes that dominated her fiction were betrayal and disillusionment. Her stories are part of a large scheme of journey toward enlightenment. And I also knew that there was pain in her life. And I became convinced that it was in that well of pain that she found the themes of her fiction. So it evolved as a series of steps. I've called this paper Marriage and Motherhood at the Core of Katherine Anne Porter's Art. All of Katherine Anne Porter's stories and novels are to some extent observations on betrayal and disillusionment. Encapsulated in those abstractions are more narrowly self-betrayal, the failure of romantic idealism, and the ceaseless and unsuccessful search for home and love. Related to all those subjects is Porter's idealized concept of motherhood. Her own failure to fulfill it and the reasons for the failure constituted the most painful core of her experience and consequently created the most powerful themes of her fiction. Tracing the formation of that ideal and her betrayal of it illuminates her canon at significant points of its development. Katherine Anne Porter said that when she was 3 years old, she knew that her mother was dead. That awareness, coupled with her father's telling her and his other children, "If your mother had listened to me, none of you would have been born," convinced her at an early age that her mother, who died 2 months before the birth of her after the birth of her fifth child, had been a martyr to motherhood. She lost her life on this point of faith, Porter said. Katherine Anne Porter's sanctification of motherhood was strengthened between 1892 and 1901, the years she spent in the home of her paternal grandmother, Katherine Anne Skaggs Porter, in Kyle, Texas, where her father moved with his children after their mother died. Grandmother Katherine Anne, spelled with a C and a second A and no E at the end of Anne, was also an irreproachable mother, having given birth to 11 children. Granddaughter Katherine Anne described grandmother Katherine Anne as saintly and credited her with forming her character. Behind Katherine Anne Porter's personal experience, of course, lay her paternalistic society's reverence for maternity, the cradle, a symbol of one of the twin roots to the altar of consecrated domesticity. Porter set out early in marriage, the only pathway to motherhood acceptable to her society, ready to achieve her own canonization as well as fulfill her starry-eyed expectation of marital bliss. But she was too young and too naive, and she chose the wrong man. She was barely 16 when she and John Henry Kuntz, who loved whiskey and other women, and for 8 long years routinely beat Katherine Anne to the point of broken bones and unconsciousness, before she squirreled away enough money to bolt from an abusive marriage that included a miscarriage but no living child. Within 2 years after her divorce from Kuntz in 1915, her hopes for romance and by extension motherhood unquenched, Katherine Anne reached the altar 2 more times, both marriages ending also in barrenness and divorce. During the years of her failing marriages, Porter aimed her frustrated maternal desire at other women's children, the children she taught in small schools she set up, like one in Victoria for a few months, academies she called them, her sister Gay's little daughter Mary Alice Holloway, and John Kuntz's young niece Mary Hasbrook. Porter loved to have Madonna and child photographs made of herself and Mary Hasbrook, and was said to be delighted when anyone mistook the two for mother and daughter. Mary Alice Holloway was yet a greater pleasure because Porter shared a blood tie with this child, and from the time of Mary Alice's birth in 1912, she claimed her as her own. My adorable little child, she called her, and hoped to informally adopt her someday. But in 1919, Mary Alice Holloway died, and Porter was devastated, imagining an important part of herself buried with Mary Alice. As the decade of the 1920s began, Katherine Anne Porter was a woman alone, 30 years old, without husband or children, but still, amazingly, with a quixotic expectation of finding the perfect man and bearing his children. During that decade, she defined marriage based on her own considerable experience in this way. It has been made very easy to assume, and fairly easy in the legal sense, at least, to abandon. And it is famous for its random assortment of surprises of every kind. Leaf-covered booby traps, spiders lurking in cups, pots of gold under rainbows, triplets, poltergeists in the stair closet, and flights of cupids lolling on the breakfast table. In 3 failed marriages, she had contended with the booby traps and the spiders, but she was still betting on the pots of gold, triplets, and flights of Cupid. The 1920s, however, were years in which she continued to endure disappointment. In 1921, during her first extended visit to Mexico, she engaged in an intense amorous affair with the Nicaraguan poet Salomon de la Selva. The affair ended in the spring when she became pregnant and chose to have a guilt-laden abortion. She tried to console herself with hopes for future legitimate motherhood while she looked for compensations for her loss and guilt. It is not coincidence that the year after her abortion she wrote Maria Concepcion, her first original piece of adult fiction to be published. Maria Concepcion is a strong-willed Roman Catholic Indian woman who suffers a miscarriage after one, her swaggering, faithless husband, runs off to war accompanied by 15-year-old Maria Rosa, a young village girl. When Juan and Maria Rosa return a year or 2 later, Maria Rosa quickly gives birth to Juan's child. Maria Concepcion instinctively goes to the hut where Maria Rosa lies with her newborn child, stabs Maria Rosa to death, and takes the child for her own. On the one hand, it is primitive justice that overrides both civil and church law. On the other, it is Porter's account of how a childless woman finds compensation in the only way she can imagine and thus displaces her grief and anger while fulfilling her maternal longing.